First thing to say, good morning everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of IT Masterclass webinars which we've developed specifically for in-house counsel. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I'm Helen Davenport, a partner in the commercial litigation team at Gowling, and I'll be chairing our session today on successful implementation of 5G. I'm joined by partner Tony Fielding. Tony heads our technology, media and telecoms team in the Middle East. He has an international client base and perspective, working and advising clients in Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Indonesia, London and the Middle East. And Tony has an additional perspective to this particular topic, as Dubai has already commenced its commercial deployment of 5G, so Tony will be talking to us about that today. In terms of housekeeping, before we begin, first thing to say is this session will be recorded and it will be available from next week on our internet channels, and it will also be circulated. So if you do have a connection issue at any time, it will be available for you to catch up afterwards. And secondly, Tony's very happy to take questions as we go through the presentation. So please do put any questions you may have as we go along into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and we'll, as I say, pick those up as we go along, and then we'll also have an opportunity for questions at the end as well. So without further ado, handing over to Tony. There's so much and hype around 5G at the moment. Is it warranted, or is the hype exactly that, hype?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining, and thank you for that introduction, Helen. It's interesting. I think there are two aspects to 5G and the hype versus the transformative realism of it. I think definitely it is going to be a transformative network service in a sense of enabling technologies that currently exist under 4G, but also enabling new and disruptive technologies and enhancing existing technologies. And in particular, I'm talking about things like sort of telemedicine, sort of autonomy and autonomous vehicles, the impact it will have with AI, and the sort of the potential that it can grant to a whole range of sectors and a whole range of businesses and a whole range of applications that will become an ecosystem that will facilitate new services, digital transformations, even service offerings that we don't actually know about. So I think it is going to be a transformative network in the same way that mobile operations were when they first came out under 2G, for example. But there is also a certain degree of hype in relation to it, and that's largely to do with the hype is about it's all happening and it's going to happen very soon. I think there are aspects of that which are true, but ultimately sort of general deployment and sort of adoption and uptake, it's going to take years, and there are multiple reasons for that, which we'll probably explore today. So I absolutely agree. There is a transformative aspect to it that can't be understated. And I think people just need to be a little bit more realistic about, the hyperbole around it, and the timeframes for sort of true adoption and the true sort of application of what 5G can sort of realise for us all.
And obviously, we're going to touch on many of those topics today as we come on to the presentation, but just also to sort of trail some things that we'll come on to later. Where is likely to be the most value seen in the implementation of 5G?
Look, I think the opportunities are clearly endless for 5G. I mean, one of the areas that I see particular value and absolute promise is in relation to healthcare and wellness, and the ability to escalate from where we are now to what it can potentially do to transform the lives and health of individuals is, personally, I think, staggering. And I also think that that world of super connectivity at the moment is an expectation, and it's just going to be a developing expectation as we consume more and more data. And in respect of that, the Internet of Things and connected devices become sort of a key underlying aspect of all devices being connected. So I think that healthcare is one example, which I'll talk about later in more detail, and as well as IoT. But definitely IoT, there is industry commentary has definitely focused on sort of the transformative nature of the Internet of Things and connected devices across all sectors, and including from the house to the business and various other ones.
And just trails some of the increased sort of risks and challenges that we're going to come on to in the presentation? What were things that you particularly pick out at this stage?
It's interesting, when I was thinking about the audience today, which I understand is largely sort of lawyers, with a few sort of procurement people as well in there, but across different sectors. I was wondering how to pitch this presentation, and I've taken the approach that I'm not going to look at the technicalities and the technical functionality necessarily in detail behind 5G networks and operations, but what I'm going to look at is the sort of the promise and the challenges that will come from the adoption of 5G and the implementation of it. And I think out of that, there's going to be a series of known legal issues, because lawyers will need to be aware of existing issues that arise under 4G networks, which will inevitably continue to apply. But there's also a raft of unknown legal issues that I think in-house counsel and lawyers generally are going to need to be aware of. So we'll explore some of those a little bit later as well in some more detail, and hopefully we'll hear from some members of the audience as to their experience and some of their concerns in relation to those legal issues.
Okay, so shall we start at the beginning, sort of taking a bit of a step back? Okay, what is 5G? Let's get us all on the same page.
Let's get us on the same page. So Helen, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So this may be aging myself, but this was one of my first mobile phones, and I certainly thought it was possibly one of the sexiest objects that I was in possession of. And I think for those of you who are of a similar age, you will appreciate the excitement that came with that. It was compact, it was sexy, it was well designed, and it allowed us to message one another, which was amazing. And it also allowed us to roam and make phone calls or roaming. And at the time, we thought that that was exactly all we needed. And that little box, that little phone, was exactly the only functionality that we would ever require. Well, that turns out that we were dreadfully wrong. Next slide, please. So what we've seen from that Nokia phone is not a revolution per se, but what I prefer to, and what commentators prefer to look at it as, an evolutionary process that's gotten us to the stage we are now, and certainly an evolutionary process which will get us from where we are now to the next stage. So what this slide sort of indicates is the, sort of the life cycle of the next generation networks from 1G through to 5G. And from this slide, I think what's interesting is, in 1991, 2G was launched, and it provided digital networks, and it let us message and travel and roam and make phone calls. And that was, a significant development. And the next significant development was sort of 3.5G, which brought this truly mobile internet experience to life for us, which enabled us to sort of have internet access and look at mobile apps. And it was a whole ecosystem which was developing under sort of 3.5G networks that showed us more promise under the new generation networks. And then 4G LTE, which was, in the last couple of years, definitely has doubled data speeds and has given us an enormous capacity to consume data, and has increased the reliability of networks and reduced latency, and enabled us and a consumer base to just gorge themselves on data, which is where we are now. And so 5G is, the next step in that sort of evolution, which is responding largely to consumer demand, as well as sort of technological advancements. And I think what we need to be mindful of is that, 5G is just the next step. There's, very much likely to be a 6G development in years to come also. So that it's an evolutionary process, and very much like what's going to happen next with 5G, it's going to be an evolution with revolutionary applications, I think is the way I prefer to look at it. Next slide, Susan, please. So at its very basic level, what is 5G? As I just said, 5G is the next generation of wireless networks that we are able to access and utilize. And it takes us beyond what we previously had, which was the 4G LTE, long-term engagement networks. And what it does, unsurprisingly, is it builds on previous network capacities and infrastructure and previous generation of wireless networks. So whilst it is evolutionary and it is new and it has incredible promise, it also builds on an existing ecosystem of infrastructure and services that are already available. And as I've listed there, the key features of 5G, which will enable all of this promise, is near zero latency, so practically no delay, which of course we've all experienced when it comes to dealing with data downloads and video downloads and the like on our mobile phones. Incredibly high speeds, which will be faster than all previous generations from which you can receive your data packages. Your data rates are anticipated to be up to the upper band limit of 10 gigabits per second. So it's an enormous data rate. Something along the line, in fact, 1,000 times more bandwidth will be available to users for a variety of new and existing services. And it also, the network gives a capacity for between 10 to 100 times more connected devices. So, I think individuals currently have maybe 2 to 3 mobile or connected devices that they own. There is a capacity for enormous and significant development in relation to that connecting via a 5G network. The 5G network will always be on, you'll always have access, it will provide you ubiquitous, always on services whenever you need them. And from a green perspective, the great thing is 5G networks require less energy and less energy consumption, and they provide longer battery life when you're using particular devices. So there is a lot of positive features in relation to what the 5G networks will bring, and also will sort of enable sort of new enhanced services as well as new technologies. And one of the phrases that's commonly used is, what 5G is anytime, anywhere, anyone, and anything. And I think that tends to capture exactly what the potential of 5G is for not just individual consumers, but basically for businesses and sectors and innovation going forward. Next slide, Susie. So what's interesting is, there is so much opportunity and promise around 5G, and telecom networks are inherently technical and technically driven spaces. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail around it, but some of the key issues which will enable, or the key technology that's going to enable 5G specifically, I've listed here. So one is obviously the technology and the use of sort of more spectrum efficient technology. And because spectrum is a limited resource, and now from a radio communications perspective, efficient use of technology to sort of take advantage of the limited spectrum is really, really critical to being sort of able to develop the roadmap for 5G. So you've got things like, and I won't throw too many acronyms out there, but you've got things like MIMO, which is sort of massive multiple input, multiple output, which is effectively involving the simultaneous usage of multiple antennas to increase spectrum use and efficiency. It will increase the number of antennas that are attached to base stations, which will enable sort of increased use of number of people to use connected services. And it will enable a greater number of users to get greater reliability and capacity. And another example of sort of that technology is what they refer to as beamforming. Now, beamforming again is basically any single transmission which can be used, but it will go to a targeted end user. And so you've got things that have developed like 3D beamforming, which is both vertical and horizontal across those planes, which will focus its capacity and its reliability and accessibility to a particular user. So, a little like the Wi-Fi, where you could be location 1 to location 2, location 3, but you could switch from different beamforming spectrum in able to access that. So there are those sorts of devices and sort of platforms which are looking at sort of really enabling an efficiency around how we can use a limited resource in the spectrum. Another challenge obviously is that, the topology and the infrastructure which is required to sort of facilitate the, and maximize the use of 5G networks and its promise for deployment. And one of those is very much about increasing the capacity and the speed and improving the network and the manner in which that network can be accommodated in buildings, on public infrastructure. So, one of the large sort of approaches or significant approaches is around densification. So it's like, the use of small cells, small sort of telecommunications and radio network cells, which will require sort of deployment across urban areas, but in quite high numbers in order to achieve what is required for sort of high bandwidth but short distance radio transmissions. So what we're seeing is sort of a really sort of a flexible and scalable, intelligent series of network developments that will hopefully sort of accommodate some of these sort of infrastructure and typology issues that we're being confronted with. And a lot of that will be driven around things like, you know, health and safety issues, for example, you know, access and accessibility, competition, and ensuring that there is fair and transparent access to networks. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for the topology of how this network is going to be deployed to really drive new innovation, as well as what will happen with the 5G network going forward. And I think an example of that is, you know, for example, machine-to-machine operations. So your fridge talking to your car, for example, or your vacuum talking to your mobile phone or something along those lines. You know, you require lower bandwidth because it's a smaller amount of data and you use the data infrequently. So therefore, that would be very different from, you know, the requirement for high bandwidth, low latency, and real-time delivery of data packages for critical or emergency services, for example, or within the you know, environment of a connected and autonomous vehicle. So I think, you know, there are a lot of enablers of this 5G technology. Spectrum I'll talk a little bit more about later as a sort of a scarce resource, and how people, how organisations and authorities are looking at it. But I think it's a really interesting space because there'll be a lot of new innovation, a lot of new technologies, and a lot of new entrants that will come into sort of being technology providers to enable a lot more of the opportunities for 5G deployment. Next slide, please, Helen. So I guess thinking about who the audience was today, and assuming that most of you are clients of the firm and also may well be lawyers in-house or otherwise, the reason I focus less on the technical issues around 5G is because as lawyers, we don't necessarily need to get involved in that, but what we do need to be fully aware of is that we have clients who will be operating in this space, and we will have new clients operating in this space, which will expect a sort of a degree of understanding and market intelligence and international perspectives on what's happening in the 5G universe and sort of the issues that will arise. So we're going to be relied upon in relation to understanding sort of those key issues and the legal issues. And, you know, unsurprisingly, and a lot of these exist in the 4G environment also, but are going to be sort of exacerbated and more risky in the 5G environment. Things like regulation is going to be a challenge because it's still emerging, and it's also not going to be consistent, and it isn't consistent currently. And there will be jurisdictional challenges. So if you're an international operator and you're looking at deploying across different regions, you're going to have different regulatory frameworks that are going to impact on your ability to engage with end users. Unsurprisingly, privacy and data protection and cybersecurity will continue to be, you know, very significant concerns, not just for end users, but for private companies, as well as governments and other users of 5G platforms. So you can expect a lot more in this space and a lot more reliance on lawyers to provide robust sort of protections and certainly contractual protections around data protection and privacy issues and cybersecurity. One of the other interesting things which I'll come on to later is, you know, the complexity of this ecosystem that's going to develop, and it has started to develop already in relation to the supply chain players. And they're not just local players, they're international supply chain players now. And the nature of those contracts and the extent of the number of contracts and the risk allocation between all of these multiple players, I think this is something that will truly impact on lawyers and will really focus their attention on understanding sort of that new supplier ecosystem and where the risk actually sits. And so again, in relation to what I've been saying, procurement integration projects, you know, 5G networks are going to sort of fast forward digital transformations for companies and governments, and you know, procurement integration projects are key to that, going from legacy tech to new tech. And so you will have a whole range of risks, a whole range of new players, and a whole range of sort of allocation of risks and contractual mechanisms that will need to be dealt with and addressed in relation to that. So, I mean, there are a lot of opportunities for lawyers, clearly, going forward because of 5G. Some will be new, and some at the moment to be perfectly honest, we don't know. And so we don't know what we don't know, but I think everybody has to be watching the 5G horizon from a legal perspective to be able to sort of advise clients, whether they're customer side or supplier side, in relation to sort of some of these really key legal issues in order to make sure that deployments generally can be successfully implemented and adoption rates can be high for this new technology. Next slide, Susan, please. Again, unsurprisingly, with any new technology and new innovations and new networks, there are always hurdles to overcome. And, you know, there are probably too many to mention really here in the time that we have. But what I would say that what I'm going to sort of focus on with a lawyer's hat on and talking to fellow lawyers is sort of the three that I've highlighted here. So one, sort of generically talking about deployment constraints, another data complexities, and another in relation to the value chain coordination for 5G and how it's going to sort of develop and be instructive to how things can be deployed. So if we on to the next slide, the deployment challenges that I think are probably the most key are things around the physical barriers to deployment of network enhancement and its adoption. And when I say physical barriers, I mean very much around, as I was talking about before, deployment and the typology and the infrastructure and the challenges around how you get hundreds of thousands of cells within small cells within central London onto buildings, onto infrastructure, into buildings, what the restrictions are around that, you know, what regulations will regulate the ability for suppliers to do that. That is a key, you know, a key challenge that deployment and operators are facing, and it's very much something that they are sort of working consistently on, trying to sort of make things smaller, make things faster, make things more sort of physically appealing, in order to sort of make sure these physical barriers don't actually operate as a barrier to entry into this market. And you know, 5G is not easy to install, and it's certainly not easy to employ, and largely because of sort of the need for a lot of volume of small cells, particularly in urban areas, and you know, and sort of the resource issues around backhaul and a whole range of other things mean that, you know, 5G is not an easy network to deploy, and it is expensive, it is capital intensive, and it has a long-term life cycle for return on investment. And you know, that is a challenge, because like setting up telecoms infrastructure previously under other generation networks, it requires a huge amount of capital input, and there is a difficulty in consolidating who is responsible for making that investment, who will get the return on investment. And so, you know, I think that expense aspect of it is a real challenge to the deployment, and certainly the deployment in the next sort of immediate future. And talking about expensive aspects of it, you know, what we're talking about is a lot of companies currently have an expensive asset database as it is. So, you know, if you have infrastructure in place, whether it be IT infrastructure, which talks to your 3.5 or 4G LTE systems, these are expensive to upgrade, and it's not going to be a seamless upgrade experience. So again, it is an issue in relation to cost. Unsurprisingly, regulatory uncertainty in the market is creating some concern around deployment, because operators aren't willing to spend the money until they know that there is some consistency and certainty in the nature of the regulation and whether there's going to be any constraints on their ability to get effectively a return on investment. And I think, you know, the last two, spectrum availability, clearly that will develop and change as 5G develops and moves forward. And as an example of what I've previously been talking about, you know, the UK Communications Code, for example, illustrates regulation about sort of rights and access to public infrastructure and providing terms and conditions around how one can do that. And these are all of concern to the key players like the operators and the developers in the deployment area. Next slide, please. So I think, you know, when we think about 5G, what we're really thinking about is data and massive, massive data sets, and the endless opportunity that businesses and individuals can get from the access to and the use of and the monetization and the sharing of that data, and not all of which will be non-public or confidential, but a large amount of it will actually be what we would think of as confidential and sensitive data. So in this new world where data has a massive value, you also get the massive risk that comes with it. So unsurprisingly, with 5G, you get an increased degree of data complexity across a whole range of sectors and a whole range of access and entry points to networks. But you also get, this 5G that exponentially sort of enables and promotes this ability and this access to sort of endless data-rich resources. So what 5G will do will effectively, enable all of these platforms and this data to be used for, let's say, truly good purposes. And that collection of massive data will see the facilitation of things, as I said earlier, like, remote surgery and remote health, or streamlined manufacturing processes, or, or true autonomy in the future. And none of these things can be underestimated, because they are truly worthwhile for us as sort of individuals to be able to have access to. But, the risks are there, and they are all data-based, largely risks. So I think that what we'll find when we talk about use cases later is that, data sharing across platforms and firms and industries and sectors, it becomes a very complex and murky area which lawyers will have to look into. And what I've listed here is, unsurprisingly again, any adoption and realization of the full potential of 5G is going to require consumer trust in the system and the network. And key to that will be data protection, data privacy, data ownership within the supply chain, the confidentiality of that data, and the integrity and security around that data to ensure that there is, high adoption and there is a ubiquitous ability to use 5G going forward. Next slide, please. The third challenge that I thought was relevant to lawyers advising, their businesses that might be involved in this or access to 5G or rely on 5G is this idea of value chain coordination. And it's a challenge because a lot of people within this industry, technology industry and in the telecoms industry, act in silos. And it's not a particularly collaborative industry because there is so much money involved and so much investment needed to sort of realize certain technologies. So I think what we're looking at now is hopefully a change in direction when it comes to this. So you've got a new world of players, you've got new supply chain ecosystems, you've got different emphasis on risk and values within that supply chain. Everybody's playing in a different sandpit, hopefully with one sort of ultimate goal, but all of these issues impact on the way that they're going to play together to make sure that we can realize it. So what we're hoping to see is a lot more sort of cross-ecosystem collaboration, particularly on issues like technical standards that will apply to the network, 5G network itself, as well as its application within certain industries and across certain sectors. And whether or not that will be an international collaboration or a national collaboration remains to be seen, but there's on both levels that is currently occurring. And then interoperability, and that obviously speaks for itself. If you've got interoperability between systems on the 5G network, you've got a much greater opportunity for deployment and development. Unsurprisingly, in healthcare, for instance, remote monitoring of patients and clients, has clear benefits for those patients, but it involves medical institutions, medical technology providers, payer services, public agencies, government authorities. All of these individuals, along with the telco operators and along with the developers, need to actually work together to make this effective and work if we are to see the true realization of the potential of 5G networks. And excitingly, I think this will lead to companies to rethink business models, and I think we're seeing some of that. And certainly, as those complexities around the supply chain develop, I think that will become much more apparent, and people will start to sort of collaborate in more interesting ways, not just in dialogue, but also contractually. Next slide. Obviously, going back to data is key to this. And for lawyers, some of us are probably thoroughly tired and sick of talking about GDPR and data protection generally. But, what is interesting about these new platforms and new innovations is that it throws up a whole range of new issues for us to sort of contemplate. And one example here is, the complexity of the supply chain in relation to data for a healthcare wearable, personal monitoring device. Who owns that data? Who monitors that data? Who has access to the data? Who can ring fence that data? Is it me, the patient? Is it the provider of the wearable technology? Is it the device manufacturer? Or is it another party in the supply chain who has control over certain sort of higher risk aspects of the deployment and the technology? And it is who determines the value of this data and how it is to be shared that I think regulation will take some steps to sort of educating us on, as well as giving us sort of a direction and certainty. But it'll also go back to these new sort of models, I think, of collaboration and contracting, which will sort of address some of these issues. And, and there are a lot of talk about solutions in relation to sort of ownership of data in such supply chains and the protection of it, whether there's been an international common data standard that will be produced, whether there's going to be sort of new aggregation and anonymization techniques, or whether or not it's simply about, in the interim, coming up with really strong contractual obligations and protections and rights of the players within these supply chains to sort of really understand and protect, your data or your risk, or allocate risk appropriately. Next slide, please.
I was going to chip in there, Tony, just keen that we come on to some of the use cases that you've prepared, because I think that really brings some of this detail that we've been talking through to life. But from my perspective, obviously the work that I do, particularly concerned about cybersecurity. 5G, is that an increasing threat, or is there an opportunity there actually to be more cyber secure?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of talk in relation to 5G providing sort of more vulnerability. So because there are multiple layers to 5G, there are multiple vulnerability points for cyber attacks. And that is very, very particularly in the case of connected devices under the Internet of Things. So yes, there is increased risks, obviously, with 5G networks and 5G platforms, because it is innovative and it is across a range of services, a range of platforms and industries. And because it is reliant on data, and that we will rely on data and companies will rely on data, those data sets are sitting out there and being stored, and they're being transferred, and they're being used, and some of that data is highly confidential and sensitive. So people will be looking to access it and breach it. So, there are security worries definitely in relation to it, and both in relation to the actual network infrastructure itself and how robust it is and what sort of mechanisms are built into it. And, it's no secret, obviously, that Huawei has come under particular scrutiny in relation to the UK 5G network because of this particular issue. And it is a trust issue for end users also. And so it goes not just to a provider like Huawei, but also to governments and operators and businesses to sort of manage that risk. And there are some risks that at the moment are unforeseen and we don't know how to manage them. But if we go on to the next slide, clearly we've got very savvy cyber criminals out there at the moment who are attacking 4G networks. 5G networks will be no different, and in fact the potential is for greater vulnerability, and you've got the likes of botnet attacks and location tracking and interception, because of the nature of being able to sort of triangulate all of this data in relation to you and your usage of your phone. So that is very true that there is going to be some concern, and indeed warranted concern, around cybersecurity and risk. But at the same time, you've got an opportunity, because of the 5G network and because we are aware of these risks, that operators and manufacturers are building these things into the actual network and the infrastructure themselves. So, the possible solutions I've listed here, they're various. And the two I've highlighted, network slicing, which is particular to the 5G network, is really about an independent end-to-end network which runs on a shared physical infrastructure platform that may be provided by, I don't know, let's say O2, but you're able to provide a specific negotiated service for a particular end use. So, for example, it might be very useful for, shopping trolleys and parking in supermarkets where they can all talk to one another, and you can find out who's parking where, how many parks are available, and where your shopping trolley may or may not be, all those sorts of things. Or indeed on a much more sort of spectacular level when it comes to connected and autonomous vehicles. So it provides a huge amount of benefits, but there is also the risk of, available. But there are mechanisms in place to try and curb those risks. And another one I mentioned there is sectoral regulation. And I think there's going to be heavy reliance on that when it comes to cybersecurity, as you'll appreciate, Helen. There is not one overarching law that applies to cybersecurity and protects us all from fraud and breaches. But, there's new telecom security regulations, for example, that do apply and do impose regulations on operators and ISPs, that they need to provide certain cybersecurity thresholds in relation to what they're doing, particularly, for example, in sort of critical outsourcing projects and infrastructure projects. Does that answer your question?
It does, and as I say, I'm keen that we come on to, I know the work that you've done in terms of preparing the use cases.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to skip Spectrum because I think Spectrum it's a technical issue, but it's obviously a limited resource. We need to figure out how to efficiently use that resource. And it's not an easy issue to resolve, and internationally players and authorities are looking at how that is going to play itself out. So the two use cases I chose were autonomous vehicles and IoT in healthcare, because I see those two as very clear examples of the benefits of 5G. Autonomous vehicles, unsurprising, there is a huge ecosystem of technology and innovation that sits within an autonomous vehicle. And obviously we're not there yet. But the automotive industry is really at the forefront of what they can try and achieve using 5G and the new platforms and the new service offerings that can give life to sort of autonomous vehicles. And we're looking at incredible amounts of data being generated within the vehicle and being transferred out of the vehicle to things like emergency services, for example, the police, a whole range of other utilities. You've got onboard computers, you've got smart cameras, you've got a myriad of radars and sensors to help you navigate, obviously, if it's going to be a truly autonomous vehicle, to give sort of the safety aspect to it. And you've got all these enhanced services that people are going to want within these vehicles. So, a lot of this is going, as I said, it's data driven, but there is such value in this data, and there's so much of it, and so much of it is sensitive data that, there are needs for regulations and rules around it. And just to get, if we go on to the next slide, going back to what lawyers are going to be faced with is a really complicated stakeholder ecosystem. So if we look at connected and autonomous vehicles, you're looking at this is just one aspect of the list. So looking at 4G, 5G satellite systems, OEM manufacturers, suppliers, cloud platform providers, and regulators and app stores, and the interaction between all of these things. And as lawyers, we're going to need to be on top of this. We need to understand the aspects of this. So if we go on to the next slide, some of the legal issues that jump to mind for all of us to sort of consider are things about, the multiple regulatory frameworks that might apply within an autonomous vehicle scenario. And that could be a telecoms operator, it's data privacy, it's cybersecurity, it's a whole range of regulatory frameworks that will need to interact in order to make sure that you're protected as a consumer, and that your car, assuming that it's going to be fully sort of autonomous, can be safe and be driven without a driver. The list there is fairly obvious, and I think liability is a key one that needs to be considered. And again, that reflects the new supply chain and where the risk allocation sits. And I think as lawyers, we'll need to be very mindful of, the very dry but very important legal concepts of sort of indemnities, cross indemnities, warranties, and liability caps, and who is responsible for being able to sort of curb the risks associated with some of these things. The next slide again is a personal sort of interest of mine, which is in relation to the Internet of Things and connected devices, of which there's going to be 50 billion apparently by sort of 2025. And if you just think of the staggering number of connected devices, the opportunities for those, and the data that's flowing between them, it's quite sort of apocalyptic in some senses, but truly revolutionary in others. Healthcare is one particular instance where these this data is key and it is critical. And I think that if you look at this slide, there are so many aspects to it, from remote monitoring to cybersecurity to AI-enabled decisions that could facilitate sort of things, as I said, like remote surgery, patient care, monitoring, simple things like, just looking at heart rates and diabetes from your iPhone. But this all relies on data, and there is higher risks of failure, higher risks, including life-threatening risks in relation to these applications, all of which will need to be managed by us as the lawyers who are advising, particularly those service operators who are deploying these types of platforms. Look at the next slide. I think I'm just mentioning some of those legal issues there. Something that new, assuring safety and standards that apply, particularly in a healthcare scenario. International standards and international safety protocols are going to need to apply to things like data sharing between hospitals and or doctors within hospitals, or within public hospitals to private sector doctors. There are all these sorts of things to contemplate. And I think that, we're just skimming the surface of some of the legal issues now that we need to sort of think about, and that many more will come out of this. And I think it's thoroughly exciting. It's slightly terrifying, but I think as lawyers, it's a really interesting time, because there will be so many new opportunities, new technology and new laws that are emerging and developing that we will need to grapple with in scenarios that we're not entirely sure about at the moment.
And just to summarise that piece, for lawyers who have been involved in advising in the previous development of 4G and rollout of 4G, what's new, what's different in your view, Tony?
In a sense, not a lot, but in another sense, potentially quite a lot. And I was thinking about this morning. I think, firstly, it will depend on the services that are being acquired or being provided. So it'll depend on whether you're customer side or supplier side. It will depend on the contract terms and conditions and the nature of those terms and conditions, and unsurprisingly, who the supplier is and your leverage as a lawyer and as a user to be able to negotiate terms appropriately. As I keep talking about, the supply chain will dictate these new contracts, who the supplier is, who holds the keys to the data, who's liable for the data if something goes wrong, or who's liable generally if something goes wrong in an autonomous or a semi-autonomous vehicle accident. How do you address that within the contracting framework? How do you mitigate those risks? Are the current terms and conditions appropriate for mitigating those risks, or do we actually have to come up with new, either more stringent, or do we have to come up with new technology agnostic terms and conditions that will capture future-looking risks and concerns that as lawyers we need to identify for our clients? Thirdly, there's very specific risks and challenges, and one of them will be around things like artificial intelligence and intellectual property. And I'm not an expert in intellectual property, and others on the call may well be, but there will be definitely issues as that AI sector develops, where it becomes very apparent that this will become a contractual concern where terms and conditions will need to be addressed. And I think lastly, cross-jurisdictional differences. There will be inconsistencies from regulation. And if you're an international operator, you're going to have to look at different frameworks across a whole range of issues in your 5G sort of deployment and or service usage. And you'll need to address those specifically within your contracting terms. So that's where I see it. 4G, it's still there. 5G is going to enhance those services. And I think the parallel to that will be enhancement of risks, and incumbency on us as lawyers to sort of identify those risks and figure out ways to mitigate them and or to get rid of them completely, or allocate them appropriately to a much more complex supply chain.
So more complex, both contractual and legal.
Yes, yeah, agreed. So really, that's what I wanted to highlight as part of this session. Helen, I don't know if you want to promote this.
Well, should we conclude perhaps with the takeaways? And
takeaways. Oh, sorry, I've skipped a slide. Apologies, I've skipped a slide. I've talked a lot, obviously. The takeaways for the audience, I think, would be that you can't underestimate the growth of data and these intellectual appetite for data that's going to drive services in the future, and the risk of that or to that data. I also think there'll be a need to understand infrastructure and deployment services and the challenges around that and the regulations that apply to that, so that you can appropriately advise providers or end users. And I think one of the clear messaging out of this is IT integrity and security, cybersecurity and risk management will be fundamental to our roles as lawyers. And I think also, just as lawyers, be mindful of the fact that sometimes we won't know the answer because we don't know the technology, and the technology is just emerging, and even the regulators at the moment are grappling with these issues. So there is, I think we have an opportunity to be slightly easy on ourselves as things happen in relation to understanding, but we need to be very much on top of the risks and how we can help our clients mitigate those risks in the best way possible.
So as I mentioned, we'll conclude with a couple of questions, and if anyone's got any further questions that perhaps you haven't put through during the course of the session, please do on the Q&A option. One question, is 5G essential for facilitating the fourth industrial revolution that we've heard so much about, or is it a nice to have?
My view is it's an absolute essential. It's mandatory for that development. And I think, given the conversation that we've had today, the general transformative nature of what 5G networks can facilitate and enable, are clearly going to be able to bring to life, a revolution, via this sort of evolution of 5G. And, we are inevitably talking about transforming private industries and governments and sectors across for digital transformation, for example, or the aviation industry, for example, or the retail and manufacturing industry. Streamlining efficiencies, raising profitability, hopefully, doing good deeds and bringing sort of egalitarian usage of these things to the world will certainly facilitate the fourth industrial revolution. And I think one of the key players of that will be artificial intelligence. And what will truly bring artificial intelligence to the foreground will be the reliance on 5G networks to facilitate the sort of the endless possibilities and capacities of artificial intelligence across all sectors.
So I'll ask a question myself and sort of perhaps changing the perspective a bit for the audience, because we've heard so much about the advice that actually we'll be giving our organisations and clients depending on our role. But how do we think that 5G will actually affect the legal services?
Well, let's hope it won't eradicate the need for lawyers, but I'm sure it will definitely assist us. And I think that we need to be open-minded and positive about the prospects and opportunities as lawyers that we get from this. From my viewpoint, and certainly as a law firm, we're Gowling's at the forefront of looking at how we can use new technologies to deliver better services. There will be new and potential artificial intelligence-driven legal platforms that lawyers and law firms will be able to use for the benefit not only of themselves from a time and efficiency perspective, but also for clients. And 5G networks, because of the massive amounts of capacity and the no latency or delay, you've got issues around things like discovery and due diligence exercises, where you potentially have the ability to analyze infinitely more data very quickly, using AI algorithms to sort of actually facilitate that also. And you're also able to do it from a mobile base. So you could be anywhere to do it, and you could have access to do these things on a particular device or a connected device that's connected to a platform within a law firm's office. Another example, I think, would be the inevitability of post-5G deployment litigation, which I'm sure litigation lawyers will all be thrilled to hear about, because it will be inevitable, and that may take many shapes and forms, including litigation that might come from some of the operators themselves, and court hearings, particularly given the operators in the UK and Ofcom's battle at the moment. And I think another one really is around IP and IP law, particularly in relation to a secondary cell phone market and the likelihood of stolen intellectual property and counterfeits being used internationally, because it is inevitable. And there's no finger pointing in relation to who will be doing it, but I can guarantee you that IP law in relation to this space, particularly in relation to the secondary market and secondary markets for new devices, will definitely bring a lot of challenges to law firms. And more work.
I'm sure you're right in all of those. I mean, from a perspective of a commercial litigator, obviously particularly interested in the possible disputes and challenges that this more complex landscape will bring. But if we've got no further questions, I propose we'll bring the session to a close. First thing for me to say is thank you very much, Tony, for your insights.
My pleasure.
Thank you to all of you for joining us. In terms of what's next, 5G is an area in which we are very active, and then coming up the tracks is a publication entitled Well Connected 5G Deployment and its Implication for Global Business. So that will be coming up the tracks. And then next in this series, as I said this at the outset, this is a series of ID Masterclass webinars, and our next webinar is on mitigating risks of cloud services, and that's on 21st of October. So if you can make it, please do sign up if you haven't already. And finally, we obviously picked up some questions through the session, and I've raised some as well. But if anyone does have any questions following the session, I'm sure that Tony will be more than happy to answer those if you want to get in touch. And there are Tony's details on the slides, and they'll also be as part of the materials we'll circulate as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm more than happy for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I hope you all have a great day.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.